actively supporting same-sex marriage and filing a brief on behalf of retaining this thing that is seen to be a club against any chance of that. It's not just you're no longer supporting, you're actively opposing.
Right, and that's why it's going to be important for people who are allied with this White House, because they have the ear of the White House, to say, hey, you did make that public statement that you were going to work with Congress to repeal this, and you promised it on the campaign trail, so hold true to it.
What happened to Don't Ask, Don't Tell?
They kicked it down the road. Look, a part of this is because they want to avoid the problems that Bill Clinton had. I mean, that's, to be honest, if Bush came in saying anything but Clinton, well, so is this White House. And expending political capital on this cultural issue for them right now is not what they want to do. Now, that's politics. The question again is, how do they compromise the politics with the principle? When do they do it? Is this going to be kicked all the way down the road into a potential second term? I mean, that's why the activists need to keep on their message and keep on this White House.
The nature of the message today, a memo, a mere request, not an executive order. Can't you or I file a request, a memo to the OPM director?
Yes, you could. We could. And if for a president who is spending several $100 billion on various pieces of the economy, he has the power to move things along at the pace he wants to.
Well, then that, to me, is a mystery by itself. But Richard Wolff of MSNBC, author of Renegade, just out now. Thanks again for your time. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Irony, just as the president gets around to attacking the fulcrum with which the Republicans enabled the corporate piracy that triggered the financial crisis, deregulation. There is tonight's fourth story in the countdown, another set of numbers not from the economy coming into play. Tonight's NBC Wall Street Journal poll showing that even though the president's approval rating is still 56%, that is down 5 points from just 2 months ago when it was 61. Possibly most telling, a huge drop in supports among independents, down 14% over the same period. The president's plan, announced today, calls for the most comprehensive overhaul of our financial system since the time of the Great Depression. The focus, restoring the regulations stripped out over the last decade. More power for the Federal Reserve, more protection for consumers, more regulation of Wall Street.
First, we're proposing a set of reforms to require regulators to look not only at the safety and soundness of individual institutions, but also, for the first time, at the stability of the financial system as a whole. Second, we're proposing a new and powerful agency charged with just one job: looking out for ordinary consumers. Third, we're proposing a series of changes designed to promote free and fair markets by closing gaps and overlaps in our regulatory system, including gaps that exist not just within, but between nations.
The Republican National Committee reaction was predictable. It called the plan too predictable. And Jeb Hensarling, the top-ranking GOP member on the House Financial Services Committee, said the bill would create a bailout nation. This week's senior editor Dan Gross joins us now from Stamford. Dan, good evening.
Good evening, Keith. How are you?
Well, sir, and yourself?
Good.
Can a president sell more regulation without hammering home this fundamental idea that certainly he believes that the economic mess started with less regulation? He didn't seem to be doing that.
Yeah, they've been very, I think, charitable to the sort of prior regime. And, it's not a question necessarily of less versus more, but of good versus bad. I mean, we had really tragically bad regulation. There was a degree to which they didn't have the tools, but, a good craftsman never blames his tools. And we had regulators who were, to say they were asleep at the switch would be an insult to narcoleptics everywhere.
Heard that phrase about a good craftsman before somewhere. How does giving more power, though, to the Fed work, no matter what the sell is or no matter what the argument is? Because the Fed didn't really work, did it, during the meltdown last year?
Well, during the meltdown, the Fed actually did a pretty good job because it started throwing money at everything. It was in the years before the meltdown that it did, A, very bad job of anticipating what would go wrong, and B, a bad job of sort of staying on top of these new developments. Greenspan would always say, credit default swaps, these hedge funds, it's not my job to regulate these things. This isn't within my purview. What this new blueprint is saying is that a future Federal Reserve chairman, even if he is a libertarian ideologue, won't have the ability to say that because they want to explicitly tell the Fed that your job, aside from controlling interest rates, looking after inflation, and monitoring these banks, your job is now explicitly to look after these components of the system, these institutions like AIG that can get so big that they can swamp everything else if they fail.
If anything, Dan, the economy has stabilized, obviously not totally, but certainly measurably in the last month or 6 weeks. Why would this president's approval numbers weaken, especially on his handling of the economy? In that category alone, it's down 4 percentage points in the last 4, 5, 6 weeks.
Well, I think two things. First is there was this sense, that we were going to have another first 100 days, and that in the first 3 months all this great stuff was going to happen and cure everything. That didn't actually happen in 1933. It's not going to happen in 2009. With every day that passes and as President Bush slips into the horizon, Obama owns more of this economy and Bush owns less of it. And while there are signs of stability, things are actually still getting worse. They're just getting worse at a slower rate. We are having, jobs are going down, housing prices are going down, the markets are clearly below where they were a year ago. So it is, we're all looking desperately for those green shoots. What we're seeing instead of it is a lot of the material they use to fertilize green shoots.
The phrase from Mr. Hensarling of the House Financial Services Committee, bailout nation. Haven't we been bailout nation since middle last week of September?
There is this sort of concerted or maybe not so concerted attempt by Republicans to pin all these bad things that happened last year on Obama. Richard Shelby was talking on one of the weekend shows about how Obama bailed out the banks last September. So in all his other powers, he can sort of teleport through time. I would trace the sort of bailout nation to March of 2008 when Bear Stearns first went down and we had this extraordinary intervention, continued right through the summer. We are bailing out all sorts of people, but it started last spring and last summer.
Dan Gross of Newsweek joining us from Stamford, Connecticut tonight. Many thanks, Dan.
Good to be here.
On this date in 1880, pitcher John Montgomery Ward of the Providence Grays pitched a perfect game against the Buffalo Bisons. 27 batters up, 27 batters down at the Messer Street grounds in Providence. Since Lee Richmond of the Worcester Ruby Legs had just thrown a perfect game on the 12th, Ward's was the second perfect game in baseball's National League in 5 days. The next one in the National League would come on June 21st, 1964. 2 of them in 5 days, and the next one 84 years later. And it would be thrown by future Senator Jim Bunning. Let's play oddball. And we begin with the story of the 18-year-old Belgian girl who allegedly fell asleep at the tattoo parlor. She says she asked for 3 star tattoos and wound up with 56 of them. The girl is now suing, saying, of course, she can have the ink removed but will still be scarred for life. It is a sad story that's gotten tons of media over the past few days, but we were waiting to get the other side of the story. The tattoo artist Ruslan Tunemians, who applied the 56 stars to the girl's face, is silent no longer.
She stand up during the session, she went down on the couch, stand up, look in the mirror, went down. And not only can I say it, but I have one witness who saw everything.
Now, how could you have possibly thought anything could go wrong in his hands? Yeah, you know what? 56 stars is not looking too bad right about now. Here in New York, highlights from yesterday's anti-Letterman Sarah Palin protest from in front of the Ed Sullivan Theater. An angry mob, an angry small grouping of literally tens of protesters took to the streets a day ago, and their message was clear. David Letterman must be stopped at all costs. But as this video shot by a reporter from New York Magazine also demonstrates, there was at least a little love at the anti-Dave rally. There it is. Indeed, some protesters in the background even found time to get past their differences and pretend to suck face. Congratulations, gentlemen, and a baba booey to you both, Richard and Sal.